There's something most people don't talk about when it comes to boundaries. We've been sold this idea that boundaries are about saying no, setting limits, protecting your energy. But here's what actually happens when you try to follow that advice. You end up feeling more isolated, more misunderstood, and somehow more exhausted than before you had any boundaries at all. The real issue isn't that you don't know how to set boundaries. The real issue is that you've been taught to think about boundaries as walls instead of what they actually are. And once you understand what boundaries really function as in human relationships, everything changes. Not just how you interact with others, but how you relate to yourself and what it means to master being human in your daily life. Most boundary advice treats humans like they're machines with clear on-off switches. Set your limit, communicate it clearly, stick to it no matter what. But humans don't work that way. You don't work that way. Your capacity changes from day to day. Your needs shift based on context. What feels protective on Tuesday might feel punishing on Thursday. Here's what no one tells you about boundaries. They're not about creating distance. They're about creating the conditions where genuine connection can actually happen. When you understand boundaries this way, you stop seeing them as something you impose and start seeing them as something you participate in. Think about the last time someone set a boundary with you that felt good. Not the kind that left you feeling rejected or shut out, but the kind that actually made you feel more comfortable, more at ease around them. What was different about that experience? The boundary wasn't about them protecting themselves from you. It was about them creating space where both of you could show up authentically. This is the part most people miss. Effective boundaries aren't defensive, they're generative. They don't just prevent harm, they create possibility. And when you approach boundaries from this angle, everything about how you set them and maintain them shifts completely. Before we go further, if you're finding value in this perspective, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Master Being Human. Your support helps us continue exploring what it really means to navigate human relationships with wisdom and authenticity. Let me show you how this actually works in practice. Traditional boundary setting focuses on three things: what you won't tolerate, how you'll communicate that, and what consequences you'll enforce. But this approach treats relationships like contracts instead of living connections between complex humans. Generative boundaries focus on three different stabilizers. First, what conditions allow you to show up as yourself? Second, what helps the other person feel safe to do the same? And third, what preserves the connection while honoring both people's reality? When you shift from defensive to generative thinking, boundaries stop being about control and start being about cultivation. You're not just protecting yourself, you're cultivating the kind of relationship where protection isn't the primary concern. Here's an example of how this looks different. Traditional boundary setting might sound like this: I need you to stop calling me after 9 p.m. because I need my evening time to decompress. The focus is on the limit, the rule, the line not to cross. Generative boundary setting sounds more like this: I've noticed I'm much more present in our conversations when I've had time to transition from my day. Evening calls after 9 make it hard for me to be fully available to you. Could we find times that work better for both of us? Same boundary, completely different energy. One focuses on what's not allowed. The other focuses on what would serve the relationship. One creates distance, the other creates understanding. But here's where it gets interesting. When you approach boundaries this way, you start noticing something unexpected. The people who respond well to generative boundaries are usually the people you want to stay connected with. The people who push back or try to negotiate these kinds of boundaries are showing you something important about how they relate to others. This becomes a natural filter, not because you're trying to exclude people, but because you're creating conditions that naturally align with mutual respect and consideration. You're not having to enforce boundaries because the boundaries themselves are inviting people into better connection. Now, this doesn't mean boundaries become easy or conflict-free. Humans are complicated. Sometimes boundaries bump up against each other. Sometimes what serves one person's authenticity challenges another person's comfort zone. The difference is in how you navigate these moments. With defensive boundary, conflict means someone is wrong. Someone is crossing a line. Someone needs to change. With generative boundaries, conflict becomes information. It tells you something about what each person needs, what the relationship can hold, and how to move forward in a way that honors everyone involved. This is particularly important when you're dealing with people who have different boundary styles than you do. Some people need more space to feel connected. Others need more closeness. Some people process conflict by talking it through immediately. Others need time to think before they can engage meaningfully. When you understand boundaries as conditions for connection rather than rules for protection, you can work with these differences instead of being threatened by them. You can say something like, "I can see we handle conflict differently. What would help you feel comfortable having this conversation?" rather than treating the difference as a problem to solve. But let's be honest about where this gets challenging. Generative boundaries require more emotional intelligence and flexibility than defensive ones. They ask you to stay curious about the other person's experience even when you're feeling triggered or overwhelmed. They require you to distinguish between what's actually harmful and what's just uncomfortable or unfamiliar. This is advanced human skills territory. It's part of learning how to master being human rather than just survive being human. And like any advanced skill, it takes practice and patience with yourself as you develop it. Some days you won't have the capacity for generative boundaries. Some relationships won't be safe enough for them. Some situations will require more traditional limit setting for your own protection. The key is recognizing the difference and choosing consciously rather than defaulting to one approach for every situation. There's also something important to understand about how generative boundaries affect your relationship with yourself. When you're constantly in defensive mode, setting walls and enforcing limits, you start to see yourself as someone who needs protection from the world. This can create a subtle but persistent sense of vulnerability and mistrust. When you approach boundaries generatively, you start to see yourself as someone capable of creating conditions where you can thrive. You're not just protecting yourself from harm, you're actively participating in creating the kinds of relationships and experiences that nourish you. This shift changes how you move through the world. You become less reactive and more responsive, less focused on what you're avoiding and more focused on what you're cultivating, less concerned with controlling other people's behavior and more interested in understanding how to work skillfully with human complexity. It also changes what you're available for in relationships. When you're not spending energy on defensive maneuvers, you have more energy for creativity, playfulness, and genuine intimacy. When you're not constantly scanning for threats to your boundaries, you can be more present to what's actually happening between you and other people. Now, if you're someone who's been in relationships where your boundaries were consistently violated or ignored, this approach might feel risky or naive. That's completely understandable. Generative boundaries aren't appropriate for every situation or every person. The goal isn't to be endlessly accommodating or to sacrifice your well-being for the sake of connection. The goal is to develop the discernment to know when generative boundaries can serve you and when more protective measures are necessary. This discernment develops over time through experience and reflection. You learn to read the signals that tell you whether someone is capable of mutual respect and consideration. You develop a felt sense of what relationships can hold generative boundaries and which ones require more structure and distance. For those who want to explore this deeper and practice these skills in community with others, there's a space for exactly that. Check out the Master Being Human community on School. You'll find the link in the description. It's designed for people who want to go beyond surface-level relationship advice and develop real wisdom about human connection. Here's what makes this approach sustainable over the long term. Generative boundaries align with how humans actually want to be in relationship. Most people want to contribute to each other's well-being, not detract from it. Most people want to feel valued and respected, not controlled or managed. When you approach boundaries from this understanding, you're working with human nature instead of against it. You're appealing to people's better instincts rather than trying to protect yourself from their worse ones. This doesn't mean everyone will respond positively. Some people aren't in a place where they can engage in mutual consideration. Some people are too overwhelmed, too defended, or too focused on their own survival to participate in generative relationships. But when you approach boundaries generatively, you find the people who are capable of this kind of connection. You create relationships where both people feel seen, respected, and valued. You participate in the kind of human connection that actually nourishes everyone involved. And perhaps most importantly, you develop a way of being in relationship that reflects your values and your understanding of what it means to be human. You're not just protecting yourself from others, you're actively contributing to the kind of world you want to live in. This is what it looks like to master being human on a practical, everyday level, not by becoming invulnerable or completely self-sufficient, but by developing the skills to create conditions where genuine human connection can flourish. The boundaries you set become invitations rather than barriers. The relationships you cultivate become sources of energy rather than drains on your resources. And the person you become is someone who can navigate human complexity with wisdom, compassion, and authentic strength.